Hello there! I am going to introduce you to oblique drawing in this video. By the end you may be able to draw something like this in oblique. Now the basic premise is that you take a 2D shape and turn it into a 3D form. So we're going from 2D to 3D. We're going from height and width into adding a third dimension along a third axis, and that happens to be in a 45 degree. How do we get 45? We imagine a square or a 90-degree corner, and we're going to fold that in half and we get that 45, okay? So when you draw out a square, which I will teach you later, we're going to then later halve that to get our axis to draw something else, hopefully more complex form than a cube, into 3D using the oblique version, which is a 45 degree angle. Firstly, we need to start drawing some shapes. Basic geometric shapes like a square, rectangle and triangle. Now a square is a perfect place to start because it is even in height and width. Then I am drawing a rectangle, which is two squares sitting beside one another, that type of proportion, okay? So two squares wide, one square high. Another shape that we're going to draw is a triangle. Now that's, you can see right now, it sits inside a square, okay? So draw out lightly a square, and then you can halve it, and then you have your triangle. This form also sits in two squares sitting beside one another, and you've seen I've kind of cut in from the left side a quarter and from the right side a quarter, so I can create my trapezium. This last shape is a circle, and again it sits inside a square, and I have divided up my square into quarters, so I know where my circle must touch the four sides of the square. I'm slow at tracing out the general shape first, and then I allow my pen to mark the paper. So here we're going to try out our first oblique cube. The first thing you need to do is again draw that square. It's going to set you out, and then we need that angle. Remember, we fold a corner of a page in half, and that will set out our 45 degree angle. Then from each corner, the top two and the far right, you can extend out that 45 degree angle, and then it's just about parallel lines, horizontal and vertical, and there you have it, you have your cube. In the next stage I'm going to show you some common mistakes. That's easy. Common mistakes. Very easy to be unaware of, but drawing a square with one continuous line is a bad habit. Then, when you extend out your lines, try not to connect them with one continuous line. It doesn't allow you to check whether your edges are parallel. Now, once you get down to drawing out your square in four separate lines, when you draw out your angles, you've got to keep them parallel and try not to connect them up with that long continuous line. See how they're not parallel? It's an easy habit to check with your pencil, to push it up and down the page, either vertical or horizontal, to check your drawing as you go. Another habit is not addressing those unparalleled lines, setting out your corner and still trying to connect the end of your edges. Here is my more correct technique, checking as I go, using my pencil as a guide for the angles, and can you see that I ghost what that vertical kind of stroke and that horizontal stroke is as I draw. Then I can go around and double check and then darken in my shape once I'm happy with it. So here I go again, tweaking the proportion, fixing things up, checking that my angles are correct, adjusting a couple of them, and drawing. For all those, I kept the page still, but typically I will move the page around as I find it easiest to draw lines coming towards my body. So I'll turn the page for whatever angle is most comfortable. And here I am going to fix up each of these drawings. I set out which are my correct angles, and I use them as my guide for my other edges that I need to have parallel. This last cube was pretty close to being correct, but I had a couple of things that I could tweak to make it look better, and I'm using darker lines to make it stand out and be confirmed on the page. So as you start to practice these oblique forms, it's really important to draw lightly and to keep that habit of drawing out the front shape first, setting out your 45-degree angles, and then you can go through that process of establishing that back surface or edges. Note that I use those colored lines just as a guide. So here I am with the front surface of that triangle, and again that shifting of the pencil across my page gives me that guide, and I even just use the shadow of the pencil to kind of mark out my angle so that it was consistent across the shape. I'm just using a pen in this video to darken my forms so that you can see it, but I do just recommend to sketch out in pencil. It's a bit more forgiving. You can apply different weight to darken. Unless you're particularly confident in a pen, a pencil is a great place to start. Okay, so parallel lines is a key thing once you start to get angled forms like this trapezoid, or triangular prism. My internal edges are a little bit lighter than the outside, and once we get to this circular form, it's really important to establish the circle first. So set out your square and get even the square correct. If it's not quite square, that circle is going to turn into an oval. So one helpful thing is if you connect opposite or set out a diagonal on a square, it will establish your 45-degree angle. So that's what I did there. I established my 45 by drawing the diagonal and extending it out. And I've got those back edges that are kind of behind or inside the form, the horizontal and the vertical, just so that I can draw my circle twice. My circle touches the square, so I'm kind of taking those connection points back so I know exactly where that little quarter of a or arc of a circle is going to go, and it's also my points that I can kind of draw that back circle with. So I'm kind of cutting down the form into pieces, otherwise it's quite a complex form, and using that yellow line just to highlight or show you where the 45-degree angle is within that construction. So my very outer edges of that form I'm darkening in to make stand out. And so now we have a series of oblique forms going off in the right direction. We get to see the right surface, the top surface, and the front. Now I'm going to go through the same forms but from the left. So the angle, the 45-degree angle, is going to head towards the left-hand side of the page, so we get to see the left surface, the front surface, and the top surface. It's a really important habit when starting to learn something, is to try out all the different ways in which you can see something in that method. Otherwise you will just only know one way, and it can be a little bit of a crutch. So here, again, each of those same forms, triangular prism, cube, rectangular prism, so we can practice parallel forms, establishing that 45-degree line or edge, and being able to partition or establish shapes at the front surface that have slightly different proportions even. See this trapezoid is slightly taller and than the last one, so it's got slightly different proportions and it's much narrower in its depth. The circle is going to be very similar. I need to make sure that my square is set out correctly, and that is the biggest kind of setup for drawing a cylinder, is making sure that the square is correct, and then it guides the rest of the form. That 45-degree angle I need inside where the circle touches the square, just so that it helps guide those arcs forms, and I do kind of want to know where the back of that surface is, that back surface, the bottom and the top, so I can draw out the full circle quite clearly. All of this is drawn with really light lines, so that if I make a mistake I can adjust it, and then the dark lines allow the viewer or someone else to see my view nice and clearly. Okay, next you have, if you are following along this video, you've drawn out a series of forms and different views, and now you can think about, well, how about I add or take them away from one another and I can draw something a little bit more complex. Like, if you can see what I'm drawing now, it's a letter. It's an A, and it is using exactly the same principles as before. I'm constructing the front surface first, establishing my 45, which side of the form I wanted to see, and slowly building up that form, and only at the end darkening it in so that it can be clearly seen. As I draw out another form, you can see that I set out a guide and I can adjust it and tweak it, and I build it up very incrementally. I really recommend that process of constructing with really light lines. It allows decisions to be made and adjustments in your form to kind of evolve as you draw it, and then you can establish your final form with darker lines. So work through your light lines, keep consistent, check those parallel lines as you go, and then you can come away with an interesting form. All the best with your own drawing.